Hello and welcome to Circle Time, the Early Years podcast. I'm Glenn Denny and I'm delighted. Well, I say delighted. I'm delighted to be speaking to my guest who's returning to the podcast. Unfortunately, I'm not delighted about our subject because it's not for good reading, uh, but it's something that I think we all know about. My guest on this edition of the podcast is the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, Neil Leitch. Neil, welcome back to Circle Time.
Thank you, and great to be here, Glenn, I have to say.
Thank you. Well, the report I'm talking about, it's not critical of your report. It's critical of how this report has had to happen. The report I'm talking about, of course, is the one that the Early Years Alliance has done called Turning Point, which is looking at the recruitment of in the early years sector. And I don't want to say crisis anymore because I think we're past that. But
Perhaps.
I know, but it is. I mean, the report it's definitely shining a light on how we're struggling, aren't we? We're really, really struggling to
Yeah,
recruit.
I mean, it is interesting that just about everybody I talk to, if go back 3 or 4 years ago, just about every question I asked was, what's the most, if you like, challenging element of being in early years at this particular point in time? And everybody would say to me, funding, 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 funding. And I'm not saying that funding is not a challenge at this particular point in time, but it is fair to say that just about every response that I get at the moment is recruitment and
Yeah,
retention. Because, just about every setting has opportunities for more children. I mean, even in our own settings, we operate 40 settings in areas of deprivation. And, I was talking to somebody today, and we have a waiting list of 100 children. What stops it? It's not the capacity of the building. What stops it is basically we can't get enough educators in the system. So that is without doubt the major problem at this particular point in time.
it really is. I mean, talking from my own experience, we were recruiting recently as well, like most settings across the country. And it specifically we're looking for level three. And I think that's the issue. We're all looking for level threes, and the level threes are rapidly disappearing and leaving the sector. Um, and nobody's pitching up. The only ones we're getting are people that are not qualified. And it's like, well, that doesn't help with ratios, which is, I think it's a universal problem.
It is, and it's also interesting to say that I've had enough providers say to me, we are now recruiting people, and I quote, that I'll try and be polite about this, but we would not have considered 5 years ago. We would not have considered 3 years ago. Um, but we are desperate,
Yeah.
and that's not good for the sector. It's not great for obviously children's development. And in an area where, in terms of education, I don't think I've ever come across anybody that works in the education sector that has said this is not the most important aspect, the most important years of a child's development. And therefore, the status, the recognition, the people coming in and the people that are able to progress should be top of the list. But it is just not the case at this particular point in time. And that's why I think we are frankly struggling. And dare I say, recent funding rates and recent challenges with the national insurance increases, etc.,
Mhm.
have done nothing to allay those fears and for people to feel that we're now in a position to be able to say we're at a turning point, I guess,
Yeah,
and that's the challenge, I think.
I think so. I mean, I've got like the key findings in front of me from your report, and it's frightening the percentages that are on this one page that's in front of me. Like 78% of respondents finding it difficult to recruit suitable new early years staff. That is a horrific figure.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to other colleagues who are involved in other sectors in terms of their recruitment and retention challenges. And whilst there are a few sectors particularly the care sector, dare I say, that generally is struggling. But the reality is, we seem to be an outlier. Retail will argue that, we're struggling to recruit, etc. But dare I say, I come back to that point that this is about creating good citizens for the future. This is about developing young children, creating their life chances. And to have a position where you have 78% of respondents that are finding it difficult to recruit in what should be probably the most, I guess, exciting profession of all. What can be more, I challenge anybody. What can be, I guess, more rewarding than shaping the lives of our children? What should be more rewarding? I can't think of anything else. Okay, well, no, I won't even go into other professions because this is not an us and them position. But I do struggle to understand why it is that we are, as you say, 78% of providers are struggling, when it should be a well-recognized profession that people are very proud to come into and stay within. Yeah, I think it is, something has to change. And I suppose I would say this, Glenn, is that the one ray of hope that I sort of hang on to, because it is quite easy to be pessimistic about all of these statistics, and I get that, and you can't pretend that we aren't in a, you refer to crisis. You can't pretend that it isn't a challenging period to say the least. But the thing that I sort of hang on to at the moment is that without intention, you have absolutely nothing. And what I do find refreshing is that for the first time in all of my period within early years, and this is not political, but you do have a Secretary of State that has said that early education, the early years, is her number one priority. So that's a good start because I say without intention, you have nothing. We do, for the first time ever, have an early education minister rather than a childcare
Yeah.
minister. So it does sort of acknowledge, I guess, the understanding that this is about developing children. It is not babysitting. It is not caring for it. Caring and education are intrinsically linked. You can't have one without the other. And I don't think we should be ashamed of the fact that we do care for for children, and we care, care is the priority for some of the youngest children who want, cuddles and love and all the rest of it. So I don't think we should be ashamed of that. But to have education come into it, which implies development and implies this is a profession, I think is a start. So it was, dare I say, incredibly disappointing that Treasury weren't open enough to come out and say, well, we have just imposed a pretty substantial increase in your operating costs with the national insurance contributions. And therefore, given that this is our offer, i.e., the entitlements are our offer, and according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, by September 25, 80% of all hours offered will be government funded hours. Why would you not turn around and say, and because we've just imposed this additional cost, we will factor that into the new rates? And to not, you can't rationalize that away. And so to make no comment, I find this is shameful. So the rhetoric is there. I think the intention from our key ministers and the Secretary of State within the Department for Education is there. It's just disappointing that the Treasury didn't consider it worthy enough, despite the fact that it's one of our key mission statements, worthy enough to do what they have criticized for decades now, almost 2 decades, certainly, that there isn't enough funding in the system. I feel like I've lectured you, Glenn. I'm sorry, but I feel
No,
quite sorry
no,
about
it's
it.
like this is the fascinating thing. I think, the recruitment part is partially, I'm going to say, down to the funding, you know, and it's interesting that yes, we do have ministers in government now that are really trying to prioritize, but it's almost like one of their own departments is like, well, you can do that if you like, but this is what we're going to do. And there's no cohesion between those government departments where it needs to be, we're going to increase the rates because you're increasing that. So we need this. Nobody's talking to each other. I
No,
think
no,
that's the
no. I
problem.
agree with you. And there's no logic in it. And I, I mean, I was talking to a journalist earlier today, and one of the things I found myself saying that, you know, this government was pretty critical of the fact that we were done to predominantly with just about every policy announcement that came out. If I go back to March of the previous year, when we had the then Chancellor stand up and say, this is the biggest expansion we're going to ever have. And I got to hear about it 10 minutes. I mean, it's not quite true. A journalist contacted me the night before, but technically, 10 minutes before he stood up in Parliament and his special advisor contacted me to advise me. That hardly feels like consultation. That hardly feels like engagement. And this government were critical of the fact that, this was, again, just announced without any real forethought. And yet, when it came to the NIC, I can't help thinking that the Treasury should have at least engaged with the sector and looked at, well, what is the impact likely to be on this particular area? And where we differ from other sectors is that, and again, this is not about competing with others or downing others. This is just about the reality. If you are in retail, which I understand is going to be impacted greatly, but you can add your 10p onto your meal or your pint of beer or whatever, not retail, but that's leisure. I mean, but you can add it onto clothes or
Yeah,
whatever it happens to be. You can do that, and the consumer has a choice as to whether they want to pay it. We are prohibited from top-up fees.
yeah,
So if the government then applies an additional charge, which it doesn't factor into the hours that it is expecting us to deliver on their behalf, i.e., a public service, there is no rationale whatsoever. There is no morality in withholding the sort of payments for the impact of that. And Treasury did not consult, did not discuss it. And I sometimes get the feeling that perhaps somebody woke up when all of a sudden the sector was saying, have you thought about this? And because just about, dare I say, every chancellor historically has just held their position, they're not prepared to basically go, you're right, we didn't think about this. We should have factored that in. And when they talk about, and I'll stop after this, Glenn, but I just feel strongly about this. When they talk about sometimes we have to make tough decisions because it will be in our long-term interest. The long-term interest that we have is that we basically stabilize a sector that has been vulnerable for a long, long time. It has as you've alluded to, this report identifies and highlights a recruitment and retention crisis we've never witnessed before. We are seeing providers, particularly childminders, leave in droves. I mean, I think the forecast is that, in not so many years, we will be left with 3,000 childminders. And at the same time, when you introduce a scheme which is looking at supporting and developing our youngest children from 9 months old, where historically many childminders were involved and
yeah,
supported, it just feels completely contrary that you cannot have a rhetoric that says we'll take tough decisions now for a long-term gain and abandon children now who in 20 years' time will be higher taxpayers, will be cost us less on crime and will cost us less on health and destabilize the very sector that creates those good citizens and those,
yeah.
I guess, good people. Just feels amateurish in a way. And I know I'm sounding really critical. And again, I don't aim this at the DfE. I've had enough conversations with the Secretary of State and the Minister for Early Education to know that actually I think their heart is in the right place. I've had more meetings, dare I say, with colleagues in the Department for Education in the last 3 months than and a willingness to meet than probably the previous 3 years.
It says a lot, really, doesn't it? That we've had so much of a certain political party in power, and it's again, it's down to like the reporting and news that so much criticism and the instability of it as well, which has not helped. We've had, it's almost like the previous government was, it was a revolving door. So, our recruitment crisis is being exacerbated by their revolving door, people coming and going and new ideas and new ministers for this, that, and the other. And how are we supposed to be stable? I think you're right at the moment. There is the right words are being spoken, the right actions are wanted
Yeah,
to be taken, but it's the lack still of joined up thinking between these departments.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, it comes back to that whole thing about we are on the end of Treasury, dare I say, has clearly a disproportionate influence on what happens in just about every department.
Mhm.
But collectively, you would hope that they would understand that this is a long-term plan. The Prime Minister himself, I was fortunate enough to be able to be invited into Downing Street to talk directly with the Prime Minister. And I probably wouldn't say anything about this meeting if it hadn't been positive. But I kid you not, we were talking about all the missions, and the one that stuck out in my, not just in my mind, but I felt in just about everybody's mind, so whether that was about safer streets or whether it was about zero emissions, etc. The most emotive element I felt in that meeting was in connection with the early years. I felt everybody got it. The Prime Minister, Pat McFadden, mayors, Tracy Brabin was there, etc. So you're absolutely right. I think, again, I come back to the intention, the rhetoric is right. But you would think Treasury would understand that this is such an important investment area. There is, I just don't understand why you wouldn't make sure that not just the next 5 years in terms of tenure, but the next 10, 15, 20 years puts us on a really good footing. And that is not about, dare I say, people like me who happen to be, dare I say, towards the end of their career. This is about creating good citizens for the future. And my goodness, when you look around in the world at this particular point in time, whether it's, recent months and riots or international events, without being overly dramatic, I can't help feeling that if we have any chance of still being on this planet in 200 years' time, it starts with us. It starts with our youngest children and the way in which we shape them. And I said this the other day. I was asked by a journalist as to, I guess, what I think they said to me effectively, what does a successful child look like when they leave a preschool or a nursery or a childminder? And I found myself saying, I don't care actually if they can recite the alphabet, count to 100, name 5 planets. For me, success is a child that is kind, empathetic, caring, grows up to be an individual that wants to do good by other individuals, because there is no value in creating the brightest sparks in the world if they do not hold kindness. I'd rather sit next to somebody on a bus that was prepared to get up off of their seat, help somebody back on. I don't care what they do for a profession. I don't care what they earn. None of it is of value if we don't have a kind planet and we don't have kind people. And where does that start, Glenn? I
It
don't think
starts
I
with
have to
us.
explain it to you, do I?
Not really, no. You're sitting there going, this is exactly what I try to instill in the children in my care. And this is what any person who comes into this sector tries to do. And, there's so many settings, PVI or, particularly, I think, that are trying to make ends meet, that are trying not to put fees up for like all this. They're trying not to add consumables charges.
Right.
But, there's all this going on whilst trying to make, you know, balance
Stay
the
alive.
books.
Yeah,
And
stay
it is
alive.
that, yeah, it's survival and it's sickening. I mean, one of the other figures here that hit me, and I mean, I've been in this sector for about 100 years, and I'll probably still be in it in another 100 years, you know. But 61%, that's the figure here, said they were aware of staff who'd left their setting in the 6 months prior to the survey coming out, who'd now left the sector completely. I mean,
Come out of it.
that's horrific. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I've been there, I've gone, do I really want to keep doing this? And I go and try something else, and I'm like, no, my heart doesn't belong there. And I come back to it. I've tried leaving twice and I've come back twice. And for me, it's what I want to do, but it does get harder. Those challenges are still there when
They don't
you're
want
trying to
to
find
leave.
the right people to
Yeah,
work
they don't
around you.
want to leave. If we made their life, if we understood the status of these people, if we paid reasonable salaries, if we were paid, funded adequately, so we could lift these people from the bottom of the pile. And when I say the bottom of the pile, there is a reason why almost every single year I'm asked to appear in front of the Low Pay Commission to explain why it is that our people are paid such lowly salaries. And then when you explain the funding challenges that we get, and that, dare I say, the previous government, when they announced the increase in the minimum wage, said, and we factored this in, Neil, because we understand that it greatly impacts your your sector. In a very proud way, they announced that. And I thought that was shameful.
Yeah,
Here you've got people that are educating, caring for. They are some of the most important. They are deemed by parents to be some of the most important people in their lives. And again, I was having this conversation this morning with someone where we were saying that they end up being nutritionalists, social workers, relationship counselors, because people trust our educators, they trust our people, and yet they're at the bottom of the pile when it comes to payment. Their career progression is not seen historically as to be in parallel with, dare I say, colleagues that are working in the primary, secondary education field. And yet, parents will tell our educators things they would never talk to other parts of the education sector about. They would never go in and say, my husband has just left me, or our partner has walked out, and I'm left with all of these debts, etc., etc. That is not an uncommon practice within some of our settings. You know it.
yeah. I've been there. I've been there.
As
It
I
does
talk about it, I
happen.
just feel angrier.
Yeah. No, I mean
So
that the other bit as well is, one of the other figures is, and this hurts me because I hate to see colleagues in other settings have this happen to them. And I have worked in two different areas within the country where this has happened. And it's like 26% thought it was likely that the lack of adequate staff, which again results from the funding, it's like that domino effect. The lack of adequate staff would result in their setting or rooms in their setting being forced to close temporarily over the next 12 months, or worse still, permanently.
yeah,
There's the permanence of closure. I mean, I've been in two settings where that's happened, or not been in them, but I've been nearby, and then we've been inundated with parents like needing, not just wanting space. Like childcare's not an just a little luxury thing; it's a necessity. I think that's the word.
yeah. No, it's a fundamental part of a child's development now, and we have to be realistic about it. And I come back to this point that I do think parents should have choices about when they return to work, etc., etc. But the reality is, I also recognize the intrinsic link between poverty and life chances for our youngest children. And I was saying this to a colleague this morning at the Royal Foundation, lovely individual who, now the Royal Foundation get it, I think. I sound like I'm their promotion officer, but I do actually think they talk about what's in the best interest of a child, and clearly they're not involved in the politics. But I was talking to a colleague, and I found myself relating to a story when I was in a nursery, and there was a mum in the corner, and she was in tears, Glenn. And I said to the manager, is she okay? And she said, she has just spent her entire food allocation for today on a travel card for a job interview. And that sort of puts life into context and perspective. And that's the challenges that some families
Mhm.
have. But that also demonstrates how critical it is that some parents feel that conflict of they have to go to work, they have to deal with these things. And so when you have a setting that is not able to support them and accommodate them, we've got a setting that we have just literally we've had to close entirely. So this is not fantasy. And we took the few staff that we had and we moved them into another setting where they didn't have enough staff and they had a waiting list. And we're trying to now recruit again so that we can reopen it probably in the summer period because we could not get enough staff. We could not recruit to that particular setting. It's located in an area of deprivation. We are a charitable organization. If it breaks even, it's as good as it gets, frankly.
Yeah,
And we can't afford to pay lots of money and we have a disproportionate number of families that only want the entitlement because of where we are operating.
yeah,
And they can't afford to pay for the extras that might help us to stay afloat. It is, as you've alluded to, a vicious circle.
yeah.
And we would never tolerate this if we were talking about 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds in school that might be able to go to school to educate themselves and to develop and to have good life chances. There would be absolute uproar. A government would lose its position if that was the case in terms of being in office. But it's all right if you're a 3-year-old. It's all right if you're a 4-year-old.
But we know it's
It's
not.
just so unjust.
It really is. And you're right. It's that bit where you kind of said it there as well when you're talking about that parent in the corner who was upset. And that is another bit, and you kind of talked about it as well, that where we are more than just your child's nursery. It's like we envelop the whole family. We don't just take your child and look after them. It's more than that, isn't it? And I think that's where some of our policymakers in government are forgetting that it isn't just a way of getting people back into work. It's there's the care, there's the education, there's the family support. There's so many little services like that go on within that, and we're not adequately funding that. Like you said there, if a school was underfunded, something would be done about it. Heads would roll at the
It'd be
DFE.
headlines. It'd be real
Yeah,
headlines in the local press and all the rest of it. And I know that to be fair to the press and media, if I go back 10 years, it, it was nothing compared to the support and the press and media that we get at this particular point in time. It's been a long time since I've read a negative report about the early years sector. I think TV, radio, newspapers all get that we are grossly underfunded. They all get that the important role that the early years play now. So I think the mood has it has greatly changed in terms of the external perception. I think the pandemic, one of the, dare I say, good things about the pandemic is that parents started to recognize, the importance of children's development, the ability to be able to engage and
yeah,
share with other children, the pressure that they were under when they were trying to hold down jobs working from home whilst the child was begging for biscuits all the time they were on a Teams call, those sorts of things. I think that's one of the positive things that came from it. We are from where we were 20 years ago, I would suggest, we are in a different place, except for perhaps Treasury's recognition of what we do at this particular point in time. And I was thinking back, Glenn, when you were talking about, we are more than that educator, that early years professional. One of the most powerful things that was told to, I sort of within one of our settings, I discovered was that we had a mum whose relationship, her partner had just walked out on her after 15, 16 years. I can't remember the number of years, but it was a long time. Just left. And She was absolutely distressed and she came to pick up her child. And dare I say, she had been drinking all day long. This was completely out of character of this particular mum.
Yeah.
And the manager took the child and the mum, went back home with the mum, and at 6:30 in the morning, when the mum had sobered up, because she knew this was a one-off incident, this was extreme, etc., came back to work. That is just humankind's wonderfulness, I guess. And it, for me, it just illustrated the important role that some of our people play in the lives of families. Now, the alternative for that, and I'm not sure this would have, what I've just told you is technically correct, and there might be some safeguarding officers out there saying, well, you should have done this and you should have done that. The alternative to that, and she did report it, etc., but she was determined that she had a contingency plan in place that would not create a even further stressful situation, because this was a one in a lifetime, if you like, instance. That child was back in the nursery the next day. The mum was forever grateful.
Yeah.
That's the importance that our people play beyond caring and educating children.
Neil, time has caught up with us, but as always, it's been fascinating to talk to you.
You're welcome. Thanks.